Ho 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 everyone, and welcome to the festivities. It's that special time of year again where we partake in joyous consumption, jolly good tidings, and of course, rampant consumerism. And as you can tell by my ugly sweater, I'm all for the holiday hype. And there's a lot of hype in our niche as well. We've just gotten Intel's Battlemage GPUs, PS5 Pros are getting into the hands of enthusiasts everywhere, and CES news is leaking more than Jensen's kitchen sink. All that to say, it's very easy to get caught up in the hype cycle, fawning over each week's next big thing, so to say. So, in my little corner of YouTube, I want to spend the holidays taking a step back and looking at the, not so new tech we've got lying around. In my Ioneo slide review, I talked about whether or not Zen 4 would make for a decent candidate going into 2025. And my consensus was that at the right price, yeah, it would. And it's not just a slide, but any used Zen 4 based handheld or mini PC is still viable for PC gaming going into the new year. Now we all know that these handhelds age very quickly. New chips are released yearly, so it can feel like the device you just bought was obsoleted overnight. Though we're at a point where the bottleneck with these little machines is the eGPU. It's a real limitation that chip makers have been trying to engineer around for ages. The CPUs in these SoCs are very efficient when they're just doing their part. So how do we as consumers sidestep around the eGPU? Well, we plug in a dedicated unit, that's how. eGPUs in PC handhelds have been an inseparable pair for quite some time now. Back around 2021, I was running an RTX 2070 GPU with my original 1X Player 1S model. It was just a few years ago when you could only use Thunderbolt to connect your Intel handhelds to external graphics. Now with USB 4 via PCIe tunneling, AMD's been able to join on the fun too. You've also got a more open standard like Oculink, but this handheld I have doesn't support Oculink with a native port, so I'm not going to talk about that today. No, what I want to discuss is effective GPU bandwidth, which is the real amount of data a GPU can move when connected to a system. When you plug in an eGPU via USB 4, it typically utilizes 4 PCIe lanes. USB 4 internally utilizes PCIe tunneling to communicate with the GPU, and the standard supports up to 4-lane PCIe 3.0 or maybe a PCIe 4.0 connection, depending on the device and host capabilities. USB 4's bandwidth is around 40 gigabits per second or 5 gigabytes per second, which is essentially a 4-lane PCIe 3.0 connection. That was a lot of word salad, but my proposed question is simple. Is it worth spending money on an eGPU setup like this to extend the life of a device like the Slide, or should you hold out for the latest Zen 5 handhelds? With an RTX 3060 connected to the Slide via USB 4, we know we'll get a big performance boost over its integrated RDNA 3 graphics, but at what cost? How much of that GPU's potential are we losing to bandwidth limitations? And does this setup still make sense with the newer and more powerful handhelds on the way? First up, we need to establish the Slide's performance by itself. Now, I've done this for the most part in my actual review, so this won't be as in-depth as that. No, what I want to demonstrate is peak sustained performance, the highest level of performance you'll get with Zen 4 at its limits. So pushing the wattage up to 25 watts and letting the system rip. Let's look at Indiana Jones and the Great Circle as our first serious stress test. We're looking at a game that only works on graphics cards with ray tracing hardware, so immediately we're already cutting things close with our iGPU and its minuscule RT cores. I'm currently in Giza in one of the main puzzle chambers, and I'm also running with the lowest possible settings at 1080p. Just standing still sees us at 30 FPS, but this soon drops a few frames as I walk around this chamber. It's untenable. But unfortunately, that's the best case scenario. Outside, oh brother, you're looking at major dips into the low 20s, high teens as NPCs and complex geometry show up. It's a stuttery mess. You do not want to play like this. But with the performance on tap, you really have no choice. Up next is Teardown. Do not let this game's voxel style fool you. You're looking at a supremely optimized and scalable game, one that can hammer your GPU if you let it. For the uninitiated, Teardown is a sandbox destruction game that lets you completely destroy the environment down to the last voxel. It's extremely dynamic with its physics, and it has its own custom software ray tracing system. Yeah, no hardware RT here. Needless to say, it's a wonderful GPU stress test for our needs. I'm on a custom map called Leon Outpost, and here a majority of the level is made of wood and other flammable materials. On my RTX 3090 PC, I can bring that system to its knees with the thermite cannon. The amount of fire and wanton destruction can lead for a lot of GPUs and integrated graphics to just be, well, decimated. Again, we're just standing still and getting about 34 FPS on average. This is at 1080p high settings. I could adjust things to be easier on the iGPU, but this is the game you really want to have 100% res scaling for. The visual quality is tied directly to the experience in my opinion. And what an experience that is. Using the thermite cannon to desecrate this castle just tanks performance, bringing us down to the mid-teens with 17 FPS on average, which of course is far from ideal. And this isn't just scene variability either, it's quite easy to load up the GPU on a completely different map. You can see the FPS dipping well into the mid-teens here as well. The 780M is being worked to the bone. Representing UE5 is Palworld, and I'd say the results so far are the absolute best. Medium settings, 1080p, no type of upscaling, sees us with a very good 37 FPS in a heavy scene. My base isn't the most bustling one around, but with 14 pals working, the GPU tends to get just as busy as them. If you switch gears and go with a more open and exploratory scene, then you see us averaging in the mid 50s and sometimes just barely touching that mythical 60 FPS mark. I would consider this playable without needing to boost graphics for the most part at all. The frame times are well within line and the frame pacing is quite good. I mean, it certainly could be better, so let's see what the RTX 3060 gets you. Going back to Indiana Jones sees us netting about 32 FPS in the heaviest of scenes, a marked improvement to the tune of 24% scene over scene. In more open areas, you're also looking at an average of about 36 FPS, and this is with native TAA, no upscaling. I turned it off since we're trying to have clean comparisons here. This is a playable result, but just barely in my opinion. I recommend liberal use of DLSS to smooth out the 1% lows, as this game and others struggle with hitting the bandwidth limit. But more on that later. Back to Teardown, and for a second I was worried. Running the thermite cannon in the outpost saw us hovering around 30 FPS and being severely GPU bound. There's a sort of immediate hitching in the game as the GPU's load ramps up to 100% before it settles back down as more data is able to be fed to the card. The fire physics and alpha effects are not allies of our 40 gigabits per second bandwidth. And checking out our scene at the Cyberpunk theme map is more of the same. Initial performance is better than without a GPU attached, but only barely in some scenes. Walking down this initial road was sobering. 27 FPS for integrated graphics, and 35 for the RTX 3060. That's only another 30% increase in GPU muscle. But the story gets weirder because eGPUs can also cause CPU bottlenecks. Yeah, that's not something people bring up about USB 4. I was able to measure this by creating scenarios where the CPU had to take on the brunt of the physics calculations. There's a mod for Teardown that lets you add a biblically accurate monster called the Basilico. This flying menace has all manner of attacks that can either wreck your GPU, CPU, or both. It has this laser move that destroys the environment and for some reason pegs the CPU while tanking performance. This is observed in the lowest sustained points for both scenarios, iGPU and eGPU. With only the iGPU, the lowest numbers came in at 14 FPS, while it was 15 FPS for the 3060. Due to the nature of the sandbox game and its inherent GPU variability, we can safely rule this as a CPU bottleneck due to the same performance readings, and not just FPS, but also power consumption. Yeah, but more on that later. Back to Palworld, and the results are far more favorably here. In fact, these show the most positive performance delta in favor of the eGPU. We went from 37 FPS in the worst scenes on an iGPU to an average of 60 in the same scenes. Exploration also sees a 16.6 millisecond frame time graph, which is excellent. Though unfortunately, the frame delivery was not perfect. You can feel the slightest hitches in the gameplay, and these aren't frame rate related, but indeed bandwidth limitations. Palworld for the most part can be a pretty static game. A lot of open environment is just static nature with the occasional pal walking around. If you contextualize this as far as memory bandwidth goes, then you realize there's not actually much to load into memory, or rather, that most of the game can fit in the narrow 5 gigabits per second data stream. It's only when new assets get loaded in, things like new pals, attack VFX, or other environments, that things can really get a little hitchy. But I still stand by this being the best way to experience Palworld on a 28-watt Zen 4 part. So what are the trade-offs here? Well, as I've already mentioned a few times, memory bandwidth is a real tight squeeze here. I want to show you all something. We're actually going to look at the memory bandwidth running in real time. I'm using Ada64 to demonstrate this, as the GPU benchmarking tools are industry leading. Before you start the benchmark, you'll see a plethora of sections in these columns here. There's a lot of fields, but the only ones that we need to care about are memory read, memory write, and memory copy. Read bandwidth measures how fast data can be read from VRAM. Write bandwidth measures how fast data can be written to VRAM. And copy bandwidth measures how fast data can be transferred internally between VRAM modules. These three variables here will tell a more clear picture of what happens when you've got data running from a graphics card to the rest of the system. And for our test setup, it paints a stark reminder though. But let's lay out a baseline first. How should the average RTX 3060 be performing without anything attached to it? Well, let's do some napkin math real quick. The memory clock speed of an RTX 3060 is 15 gigabits per second. Then you've got the bus width of 192 bits. So if you do the math, that means your theoretical max bandwidth is 360 gigabytes per second. So let's see how close we get to that with the RTX 3060 by itself in my main editing rig. As you can see by the numbers, we're looking pretty good. Our read speed is 25 gigabytes per second, our write speed is 23 gigabytes per second, and our copy speed is 313.34 gigabytes per second. All in all, pretty solid results. This card is far from being bottlenecked at these speeds. Now, onto the results with an eGPU setup. These benches are actually best run with a game in the background, as the only way to derive accurate numbers is with some sort of load on the card. At any rate, here are our results. The read speed is 3 gigabytes per second, write is 2.7 gigabytes per second, and copy is 308.90 gigabytes per second. Pretty crazy reductions in bandwidth across the board. That's an 88% reduction in read and write speed, followed by only a 1.4% reduction in copy speeds. The read and write reductions are the most important here for gaming though. You lose nearly 90% of the card's native performance, which in theory is fine if the loss in native performance can be overcame when the card is supplanting an integrated graphics card. And well, do we overcome that huge gulf by chance? Well, let's run some more numbers. If we take the averages from each game and then normalize them, we get an average positive performance delta of 66%. Now, this of course is a supremely small sample size of only 3 games, but hey, the slide has a tiny SSD, so I couldn't load up my usual test suite. And despite this performance delta, we're still leaving more performance on the table. Memory bandwidth on eGPUs aren't the only limiting factor. You can also be power limited via the PCIe tunneling. USB 4 uses PCIe tunneling to connect the eGPU to the system. This means that some of the available PCIe lanes and their bandwidth are allocated to the eGPU itself. Now the 7840U and all derivatives only have 20 native lanes, 4 of which automatically go to the eGPU setup. Dedicating PCIe lanes to the eGPU can restrict both bandwidth and power available to other components, well, including the CPU. When you connect an eGPU via USB 4, the system has to share its limited power and bandwidth between the CPU and external graphics card. This can result in the CPU receiving less power. I mean, this is what was causing those IR-related hitches earlier. Even with 60 FPS readings, we still couldn't escape them. Not enough data being moved fast enough. It's an exponential issue with setups like these. But this is the preferred trade-off, honestly. You do not want peak CPU performance in most games over the GPU. You gotta remember that most games are GPU bound still, so the system prioritizing the eGPU to maximize its graphics performance is preferred over a CPU boosting needlessly, even if it means we only get 11 watts for the CPU. So what's the verdict? What's the better investment? Should you invest in an eGPU setup for a slightly older system like the Ioneo Slide, or save for the latest and greatest? Well, with a GPU like the RTX 3060, paired with a Zen 4 based APU, you're looking at approximately 60-ish more GPU performance over the 780M. Now, this only makes sense over a new Strix Point handheld if you can get everything for well under $1,000. For reference, my iNeo slide was $500, my one dock V2 was $50, and my RTX 3060 was $180. So in total, I spent about $730 USD. The cheapest Strix Point handheld I can find was the 1X Fly F1 Pro with a Ryzen AI 9 365 processor. It's $1,000 before tax, which is quite the dent in your pocketbook. More performance, yes, but still a significant increase in dollars over last gen. I'm not a straddle the fence sort of guy, so I would say that it's worth investing into older platforms with eGPU support. My slide to the 1X Fly is a 50% increase in price, but you're not always getting 50% increases in performance, especially when operating at peak power envelopes. See if you can strike a deal for a Zen 4 device at $500 or less. That's where the magic lies. As we go into 2025, the price for Zen 4 devices will only fall in the used market as people fund their upgrade cycles. Bonus points if you can find a handheld or device that supports Oculink. It's not plug and play like USB 4, but the bandwidth increase is so welcome. I actually can't wait to get an Oculink device in one day for comparison, but at any rate, that's going to be it for me. Thank you all for spending a little time with me this Christmas, and I hope your holidays are absolutely merry and filled with good tidings. Until next time, everyone, this is the Silicon Fox saying ciao.